My name is Jamal Ben Omar, and I'm a former Under Secretary General at the United Nations and a former UN Special Envoy. I'm currently the chair of the International Center for Dialogue Initiatives, or ICDI. ICDI is an independent platform focused on conflict resolution and mediation in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Sahel regions, working towards empowering local and regional actors, including civil society, to play a more prominent and leading role in mediating the conflict that affect them, instead of continuing to rely on foreign and international actors who have their own interests. This podcast, titled ICDI Dialogues, accompanies our monthly newsletter, Diplomacy Now. Through the podcast, we hope to challenge the status quo of both conventional diplomatic initiatives and diplomatic discourse through inviting leading voices from the regions and countries affected by conflict. In this podcast, we turn to the conflict in Sudan that has been raging for 2 years now with no end in sight. Sudanese analyst Dr. Suleiman Ali Baldo and Khulud Khair are our guests. Let me introduce first Dr. Suleiman Ali Baldo. Dr. Suleiman is no stranger to those monitoring human rights and conflict through Africa. He's a widely recognized expert on conflict resolution, emergency relief, development, and human rights in Africa, and on international advocacy related to these issues. He has worked extensively in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Sudan, and served for several years at Human Rights Watch as a senior researcher in the organization's Africa division. He worked as a senior analyst before becoming the director of the Africa program at the International Crisis Group and at the International Center for Transitional Justice. Now, Suleiman serves as the executive director of the Sudan Transparency and Policy Tracker that he established in 2022 to respond to the need for more organized and sustained anti-corruption campaigning. Since the outbreak of the war in Sudan in April 2023, the organization has been monitoring human rights abuses and mediation efforts. A regular contributor to ICDI's newsletter, Diplomacy Now, we are honored to have him on ICDI Dialogues to speak about the devastating conflict in his homeland, Sudan. We are also very pleased to have with us Khulud Khair. Khulud is a Sudanese political analyst and the founding director of Confluence Advisory, a think and do tank based in Khartoum. Khulud is also a radio broadcaster. She hosted and produced a weekly radio program called Spotlight 249. Khair has over a decade of experience in research, aid programming, and policy in Sudan and across the Horn of Africa. She has written for Foreign Policy, Al Jazeera English, the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, and other outlets and organizations, and has been quoted widely as a political analyst in the media, including in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, and NPR. Welcome to the podcast. Let me start. Well, first, let me remind our friend Suleiman that we have known each other for a long, long time. I don't know if you remember when we met the first time, but I do. I think we met immediately after the overthrow of Bashir, after the 30th of June, 1989. I was working at that time for Amnesty International, and part of my responsibility was in the research department was Sudan. So I came to Sudan immediately after the coup, and that was when we met. And many human rights activists were arrested. There were lots of arrests and people detained. But for some reason, you had escaped arrest, at that time. I remember you were, one of the leading human rights activists at that time, in touch with Amnesty International and the international human rights community, and you did an amazing job. I still remember this very well. You're very brave, and I have a lot of respect for all the work that you have done.
I recall these days very well. This was really a very tough period, right at the beginning of the coup of Omar al-Bashir. there was a massive wave of arrests, what they call preventive security, not because anyone did anything to threaten the new regime, but because they have been tracking and observing activities of civil society organizations, human rights groups, political parties, and they had a whole list of people to detain preventively to stabilize the regime. And that's the time when I entered into communication with Amnesty, and we met definitely and cooperated on how to address this crisis.
Yeah.
So that's really quite some time now. But this would lead us to the focus in this discussion, because how did we get here today in 2025 to this major catastrophe that is happening in Sudan, the war that is happening? And this war of today is very much linked to the 1989 coup d'etat of Omar al-Bashir. Al-Bashir created a system of autocracy, of kleptocracy from that date in 1989 right through 2019, when he was brought down by protest from the youth of Sudan, the women of Sudan, the general civil society and population, rising to demand justice and to demand fair access to the country's natural resources that have been monopolized by those in power in the regime of Omar al-Bashir. The structure of that regime explains why some of the aspects of the conflict today are very difficult to resolve. Because when that regime fell, the army and the rapid support forces were together part of the security apparatus of the regime. The rapid support forces were created as a force auxiliary to the Sudan armed forces to repress rural insurgencies, and that's why they were given carte blanche to repress civilian populations in all the peripheries of Sudan, where the population always was restless because of the concentration of power and wealth in the capital, in the center. Sudan armed forces, therefore, relied on the rapid support forces as its infantry. When Bashir fell, that security apparatus survived the fall of Omar al-Bashir. And they entered into the transition, allied forces, military forces, imposing themselves on the civilians who brought down Omar al-Bashir in this joint period of military-civilian cohabitation into the transitional period. And together, they did everything possible to derail the plans and to derail the reforms that the civilian-led executive tried to implement, until coup d'etat occurred in 2021, when they were not able to basically entirely derail all the reform policies, particularly in the economic sector. And again, the coup d'etat of 2021, which the army and the rapid support forces conducted jointly, explains part of what's happening today, because you don't have two generals leading a military regime. One of them has to prevail. And this is what ended up being, leading to what's happening today. The army, the rapid support forces, still are in agreement to see any aspirations of the civilian population for democracy as anathema, and wherever they have exercised control during the current war since 2023, there have been repression against civilians, and particularly the activists of the pro-democracy movement, the human rights activists, the democracy activists, those who are working to be the real voices of communities oppressed by this centralized system of government. So I don't know whether Khulud would agree with me.
Thank you very much, Suleiman. Khulud, just to elaborate more on what Suleiman said in terms of understanding the background and the root causes of this conflict, there was a transition, and a transition that collapsed or failed. What do you think this has happened? And also, if you can explain how the political map in Sudan has evolved. When I was talking about earlier about the first time when I met Suleiman in 1989. The main political parties at that time were Ummah, DUP, SPLA, Communist Party, professional associations. The map is now definitely very different. If you can kindly explain briefly how these dynamics have evolved.
Sure. I mean, I think the thing to note here is that there was a transition after the fall of Omar al-Bashir, but it lasted just over 2 years. And during that transition, the civilian cabinet was wholly disempowered. Every major decision was left to the Sovereign Council. The Sovereign Council was made up of the Sudanese Armed Forces, Rapid Support Forces, and a sort of amalgamation of different security actors and armed actors. And it's that entity that ended up actually setting the tone for a lot of what could be achieved during the transitional period. And of course, they had no interest in letting a civilian cabinet be really successful in proving just how effective civilian government could be. So, especially being in Sudan at the time and really tracking month on month how difficult it was for the civilian, not just civilian cabinet, but civilian entities working around the country, whether it was the services and change committees that were grassroots led, mostly volunteer actors that particularly during the COVID pandemic were instrumental in spreading awareness and, around how to keep COVID at bay and how to, get vaccinations, etc. All of that was undermined at every stage. There were certainly failures by that civilian cabinet. But I think chief of which, and where all of these other failures stem from, is this naive, perhaps naive sort of thinking that, now that Omar al-Bashir was gone, that his security state could be relied upon to some degree to see through some of these, civilianized processes. But of course, the security sector did not want to give up power. The security sector did not want to be subjected to transitional justice mechanisms or any kind of economic processes that would see their ill-gotten gains over decades taken over by the civilian, for example, civilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the civilian Central Bank of Sudan. But they also didn't want to see their troop numbers dwindle because they knew that without their troops and without their vast security apparatus, they would not be able to govern Sudan or to rule Sudan really with an iron fist as they had done before. And so by the time the coup of the 25th of October 2021 came around, it was very clear that, that sort of the regime was striking back in many ways. The security military complex in Sudan was striking back against the revolution. And it's within that context that I think this war is best understood. This is an anti-revolutionary, a counter-revolutionary war. It is very much designed to minimize the civilian voice and to minimize the civic space and to really put down any civic, pushback or any pro-democracy action. This is why we see that while SAF and the RSF, are waging a war against each other and killing each other, they were also and mostly targeting the civilians across Sudan, particularly in urban areas and particularly those that are still organized, be they the resistance committees that brought down Bashir through their revolution or the emergency response rooms, which are volunteer-led mutual aid groups that came out of the resistance committees and are leading the humanitarian response. So where do political parties fit into this, in answer to your second question? Well, political parties have spent so long in opposition to Omar al-Bashir that they found it very difficult to pivot to the anti-regime protests. But once they got a handle of that, they sort of got fixed into that role as anti-regime, and they could never really articulate well a vision for what a post-Bashir Sudan would look like. And to some degree, they're still failing to articulate now what a post-war Sudan would look like. Now, that isn't a problem for many of the grassroots groups, whether they're youth groups, women's groups, resistance committees, etc., who, for example, in the case of the resistance committees, have come up with political charters. They have unified them to the fullest extent possible just before the war broke out. And they're really trying to grapple with this idea of what it is to be Sudanese and how that can be, sort of brought about. And these people are not the ones who, they're not people who really look towards any political party to give them any answers. They have realized that political parties can be co-opted, they can split when they don't agree, and that effectively they haven't been that effective in bringing down military rule. And it's exactly that military rule that needs to change. It needs to be disintegrated and demolished if Sudan is to see an end to the sort of endless cycles of conflict, but also a space to really configure what it means to be Sudan and to have a peaceful and prosperous Sudan take root.
Suleiman, there is a new generation of activists in Sudan youth, women, civil society. If you can just tell us a little bit more about the dynamics in civil society in recent years and what role it is playing. The political map is very much different to the one we described. I remember going to Sudan in early 90s, and at that time, in the context of initiative initiated by President Carter, who was working at the Carter Center at that time, and the aim was to bring together Sudanese in some kind of dialogue. And the key, most important person at that time that I had to meet with and argue with him for hours was Hassan Turabi. What happened to his party and its influence, even within the army?
Well, that definitely has a lot to do with what happened then and what's happening today. Sudan Islamist movement, which is the local branch in Sudan of the Muslim Brotherhood movement in the Middle East and North Africa and beyond, is very much central to all this period that we are discussing. The ideological party is the Sudan Islamist movement, and it is the one that engineered and carried out the coup d'etat of 1989 using members of cells that are loyal to the Brotherhood movement within the army to topple an elected government in June of 1989. That Islamist movement, the ideological movement that is committed to a certain version of political Islam, very much, dedicated to changing, society and bringing it to the image of the ideological movement, then created a political party, the National Congress Party, the ruling party during the period of Omar al-Bashir. And the ruling party, with the backing and control of the Islamist movement, took control of the institutions of the state, different ministries, fired overnight hundreds of thousands of civil servants, officers in the Army Corps, people in the diplomatic corps, university lecturers, to replace them with loyalists to the Islamist movement, and therefore take control of the state through the, this purge, massive purge, and at the time, if you recall, while we were monitoring Sudan, there were this endless list of professionals and workers and different sectors of society affected by dismissals and preventive detention. Systematic torture was practiced in these ghost houses to really force a shock in society that would change it. This Islamist movement is, the power behind today's Sudan armed forces. It continues to control the officer corps because of this long history of its infiltration of the army and the building of cells and individual officers who are loyal and committed to the agenda of the Islamist movement. So that movement is the only one that remained focused, is the one that built support for the army's role in the current war by controlling the mass mobilization of volunteers to join the army effort. It's the one that has really dictated the agenda with regard for the mediations. For example, whenever there was an attempt by the army command to open to some platform or initiative of mediation, you would see that the Islamist movement, which is the power behind the throne today as in the past, would veto that in a public campaign of denigration and of criticism of the army commanders for being weak just because they are willing to talk peace. So this is the situation today. The opposition parties, I agree entirely and subscribe to what Khulud has just said, because they emerged from 3 decades of Omar al-Bashir rule quite weakened, quite divided. The issue of the new generation is they brought Bashir down. The youth, the women associations, who have built a real grassroots movement at community level, building this resistance committees throughout the Bashir rule, servicing the population, gaining the trust and confidence of the population through voluntary work in neighborhoods, improving the environment, supporting the population in different ways, helping them survive through harsh economic realities of the Bashir regime. And when it was time to go against the regime, the population followed them. There was mass more population and therefore a massive movement, too large, too much across the land to be able to be suppressed by Bashir regime, and that's how they brought it down. These resistance committees are civil society organizations, grassroots groups that after the war assumed the role of frontline humanitarian actors by setting up emergency response rooms. And that's the role that this new generation is playing today. They are the ones who are there protecting the civilians and providing them with survival needs in very harsh conditions when they are targeted, both by the army and the rapid support forces where they operate. So that generational change is not often taken into account, and it should be, because this is this is really the civic forces and the civil society groups of Sudan of today.
Khulud, can you add anything about this new phenomena of the new generation of activists, popular committees, the role of civil society in Sudan today?
Sure. I mean, the first thing is that it's not new. Unlike a lot of countries in the region, both in Africa and the Middle East, Sudan has had 3 successful revolutions, with 2018, 2019 just being, the latest one. But what we saw in 2018 and 2019 that I think differed from the revolutions in the 60s and the 80s was that you had a much broader base for the revolution. You had people from across the country. You had women being much more represented than they were before. And the movement, the protest took so much longer to unseat Bashir than they had his predecessors, the other military dictators that were brought down through revolution. And so there was a sense of a community that had sprung up within those groups, with particularly youth groups and women's groups, etc., and ordinary people from all walks of life. It was no longer, revolution is the preserve of the middle class. Everyone from all different walks of life really joined the protest. The protest also didn't start in Khartoum like they had before in 1964 or 1985. They started in Blue Nile, an area that has seen a lot of war, a lot of conflict, and a lot of marginalization. And so really I think this revolution is both learning from and sort of an accumulation of the revolutions and uprisings that came before, but also unprecedented and really sort of breaking the mold in the best of ways in terms of the pro-democracy movement. And this is what makes it such a threat to the security sector in Sudan and to the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan. And the way that we have seen them respond to this is that they are not just putting down the individuals that make up these groups. So, for example, disappearing them, killing them, arresting them, or detaining them without charge, and also accusing them of siding with one side or the other, accusing them of being agents, etc., in order to vilify them. So that's one key way that they have done this. Another key way is that they have tried to reframe the revolution of 2018, 2019 as not the real revolution. This is particularly on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood, who, of course, during the protests to bring down Bashir, the Muslim Brotherhood, the military state, they were public enemy number one. And in order for them to make a comeback, which they're very much trying to do with this war, they have to have a new public enemy number one. And they have decided that they're going to make the RSF that public enemy number one. And the RSF is such a heinous outfit that they themselves created, the Islamists and the military state in Sudan, that it becomes very easy to hate the RSF for everything that they've done, for the rapes, the lootings, the systematic ethnic cleansing and genocide that we've seen, particularly in Darfur. And it is through that sort of hatred and serious animosity towards the RSF that they're trying to create a sort of a broad political bloc that supports them, not just the army as a national institution, but also a comeback for them. And so there's this reframing of the current war as a real revolution. This is the true revolution against the RSF. That is, the thing that will bring all these people together. Yes, against the RSF, but also for the military state as it is under the Sudanese armed forces, and for a return, to give a mandate for the return of the Islamic Islamist movements. And that, of course, is very difficult to achieve because it wasn't that long ago that these very same people who make up the bulk of Sudan, Sudan's median age is 19.6. It's an extremely young country. And these people remember 6-7 years ago when they brought down Omar Bashir, they remember who their true enemies are. And though some of them have been pulled in one direction or the other, there's still a large proportion of people in Sudan who know that, the original sin of Sudan was that war started even before independence, that we've never had a national project in Sudan that could unify people. We've never had, sort of a national project that could really put foundations for a peaceful coexistence between Sudan's many groups and many ethno-linguistic groups, many, sort of geographic groups, etc. And the real threat here to the Islamo military rule, as it was under Omar al-Bashir, but also as it is shaping up to be increasingly under the Sudanese armed forces, is that regardless of the number of armed rebellions that Sudan has had, it has never been an armed movement in rebellion that has brought down the incumbent, that has brought down the dictator of the day. It has always been non-violent mass mobilization, peaceful mass mobilization against the military state. And so really what they figured out is they can make peace with the RSF at some point. If the price is right, if the conditions are right, they can bring any number of different armed groups, even if they are enemies today, into the fold of the state, give them a ministry here, give them a pot of gold there or a gold mine there. And they can make some kind of power-based, power-sharing-based, wealth-sharing-based agreement. They can't do that with ordinary people pushing for democratic rule, because ordinary people, pro-democracy groups, women's groups, youth groups, they know that the only way to really stop the never-ending, incessant wars that Sudan has is to change the militarized system into a civilian system where power can be you can compete for power as different constituencies without using the gun. And so having identified these groups as the actual main threat to their resurgence in power, we see these groups really be targeted in a myriad of ways.
Thank you. Let me turn now to efforts to mediate this conflict. There have been various initiatives by different organizations, but it's fair to say that as of today, there is no one political process, inclusive process, and at resolving this conflict. And it's fair to say that mediation is a mess. There is competition among various actors, IGAD, African Union, UN, countries involved somehow in the conflict, but also pretend to mediate this conflict. Suleiman, explain to us this mess. What's going on?
Well, the major problem right from the beginning was the focus on ending the fighting without clear strategy for what happens next, or even how to end it in terms of actual process and actual logistics of observation of a ceasefire and what actors would be involved in that. Humanitarian cessation of hostilities, the question of humanitarian access was, and cessation of hostilities was the core of Jeddah, negotiations that occurred with the mediation of the US and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia weeks after the conflict began. On 11th of May 2023, the parties reached a declaration of commitment to the basic tenets of international humanitarian law, protection of civilians and allowing humanitarian access and so on. That was never respected or upheld by neither of them. And there have been attempts to revive Jeddah talks, and the mediations never went beyond this, this focus on cessation of hostility. There are, there were at the same time attempts by the sub-regional organization, the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, which is the IGAD, as the organization for which Sudan belongs in the structure of the African Union subsidiarity, structure. IGAD should be the first to offer mediation and lead on it, and then the African Union should be, the framework for that mediation. And the focus from the African Union at the time was really we will be the ones convening the political phase of the mediation. However, they never got around to have a clear roadmap and clarity on who should be, in the room when it comes to the, convening the civilians. Khulud, you have been monitoring all of this. I know that, you also, saw in some shortcomings, even in Jeddah 3, which was the negotiation that took place in Geneva later on. So what's going on with all this in response to the question from Jamal?
Yes, Khulud, if you can elaborate a bit more on how you see this process of mediation or mediations, different initiatives that we see from time to time, and all of them not taking off, all of them failing. What's wrong? And in your view, who should be participating in any mediation process? Who should lead this process? Who should facilitate it? And what lessons can be learned from past experience?
Well, the most sort of promising, initially at least, the most promising talks were the Jeddah talks, because they were formed so quickly after the war broke out, and they were able to negotiate not just that May 11th agreement that Suleiman spoke about, but also a series of ceasefires that actually never held. But they were at least able to get the two parties to Jeddah for talks, which is unlike some of the other talks that we've had since, for example, Geneva in August of last year. But there were several problems with Jeddah. Firstly, the Americans and the Saudis effectively jettisoned any kind of multilateral setup that was there before the war. There had been a trilateral mechanism between the UN, the AU, and the IGAD to sort of resolve the issues with the coup. As soon as the war started, the Americans and Saudis dropped any kind of engagement with the multilaterals and went it alone in Jeddah. That was a huge mistake because there were so many moving parts to this. There are so many actors involved in this. I often tend to think of this war as a globalized war taking place in Sudan. And so many of those actors were missing from the peace, which means that none of them really had any incentive to end the war. The second thing is that Jeddah assumed that you can get a ceasefire in place very quickly before you sorted out the political problems between the belligerent parties. And that simply, does not track in terms of what we have seen, the political reasons why this war broke out. And two, that has never been the case in Sudan's many, many wars. The ceasefire protocol is almost always the last to be signed after the political arrangements have been made. And thirdly, the Jeddah process failed to see how the different parties, but particularly the RSF, were using the Jeddah talks as diplomatic cover for the atrocities that they were committing. In Jeddah 1, during the summer of 2023, they were committing acts of genocide in Jenaina, West Darfur, just on the border with Chad. And then in October and November that same year, during Jeddah 2, they also committed acts of genocide in Ardamata, also in West Darfur. So quite clearly, they were not there to bring about peace, but they were there to continue fighting the war and give themselves some kind of cover for it. All of that, I think, instituted as sort of a very topsy-turvy setup that the international community and mediators have never really been able to leave behind. The most successful of the different attempts has been the Manama talks in Bahrain that took place in January and February of 2024. And those talks were, to some degree, successful because it was the security, elements of the different governments, the Egyptian, the Emirati, the Saudi, the Qatari, the Bahraini, with some support from the Americans and others, who gathered in Bahrain with, sort of representatives of SAF and the RSF to try and come to some kind of security arrangement. They had come to a security arrangement, and the Sudanese Armed Forces representative, General Shamsuddin Kabashi, the number 2 of the military, signed the deal and then got back to Port Sudan, where immediately the deal was disavowed because it did not meet the political interests of the Islamists, who saw that the war had to continue, which really gives you a sense of how much power they have. But all that is to say that even a sort of a security arrangement that does not look at all the different competing political and civilian elements of this sort of political picture will also fail. So in answer to the second part of your question is, what does an ideal sort of a mediation process look like? Well, first of all, it cannot solely sort of rely on the military actors, because mediation in many ways rewards the belligerents. It says, if you carry a gun and you wage war, we will bring you to a table, we'll give you some modicum of legitimacy, and we will elevate your interests above everybody else's. So not only does that provide a perverse incentive for many others across the country to bear arms, which they are currently doing, but it also means that you're effectively only looking at security actors and not at all to other groups, be they sort of armed or civilian. And we will see now, I think, increasingly that this is a very sort of myopic approach, because this war has metastasized not just to different parts of the country, but it has really infiltrated groups across the country, particularly ethno-linguistic and tribal groups that really were not armed in the same way as they were before, but now bear arms and have a lot of conflicts, including localized conflicts between them and other tribal groups in the region. And so unless you can come up with a way of figuring out local ceasefires as well as a national ceasefire, there's no way that a national ceasefire alone is going to hold. And so it has to be, we have to look at the local picture, at the national picture. We have to include civilians as much as possible. I think the mediation table itself needs to be built around a civilian agenda. As long as it's built around a security agenda set by the two main belligerents, SAF and the RSF, we may get a pause for the fighting, but we won't get an end to the war itself, because we cannot have a technical solution, that is ceasefire talks around security arrangements, for a political issue. That is the whole reason why this war broke out. And so there is, the question of who guides that process. It is very difficult to answer right now. We saw previously that the Biden administration was, trying to sort of engage with this issue, particularly around the talks. It was leading on many of the talks. It was trying to bring in different countries, including those that we know that are supporting the different belligerent parties, for example, like the UAE that is supporting the RSF, but also like Egypt, Saudi, etc. And of course, if the UAE is involved, the Sudanese armed forces immediately rejects the talks. But its friends in the region that are providing it with arms, the Turks, the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Qataris, they are always part of the talks as well. And so there have to be sort of, I think, guarantees given that a process will be one in which, Sudanese actors and not just their Gulf allies are going to be, sort of given, the interests of those actors are also going to be given due consideration. There is no perfect, I think, mediator in this. There's so many different countries that are involved in this war that, frankly, that doesn't exist. Ordinarily, this is where the United Nations would step in. And actually, arguably, this is the only conflict in the world right now where the UN has a role to play. It cannot play that role in Ukraine. It cannot play that role on Israel and Palestine, but it could potentially play that role on Sudan. It's just refusing to do so. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has basically said that it's the African Union's problem because this is an African war. And as I said earlier, this is not an African war. This is a globalized war taking place in Sudan. So it really should be the United Nations. But the United Nations is not willing to do so. The AU and IGAD are too weak themselves and, frankly, too embroiled in their own internal and regional issues to really, I think, have the bandwidth for an undertaking as big as this, a political and a ceasefire track that are exclusive but also complementary. And so this is the problem that we have. And many countries in the region, whether they're directly involved or not, have gotten into the stage of, rather than seeking a solution for this war, rather, instead seeking the management of this war so that they don't lose out in terms of, addressing and meeting their interests, but so that also their political competitors don't gain the upper hand. And this is very, very tragic, but also deeply unsatisfactory for the people of Sudan, for whom, regardless of how the front line shifts, it is issues of famine, issues of lack of access to services, particularly health and education, or lack of access to livelihoods. That is, they're going to continue to suffer across all of these three strands unless this war is put to an end.
Thank you. Let me turn to you, Suleiman. You followed this mediation process for a long time. If you can kindly give us a bit your insight on why all these attempts at mediating have failed in recent time. I agree, there is no one formula for mediation in any given conflict. In each situation, we'll have to ask the question, who is best placed, to play the leading role in mediation? It could be civil society group, it could be a personality, a local personality, it could be a neighboring country, it could be a regional organization, or the UN, itself. In the case of Sudan, based on everything that you have seen, how do you imagine a process that is different, that is inclusive, could really facilitate the resolution of this conflict?
I can imagine and think this is what is very much needed, an international mediation, not necessarily led by the UN. There are signals from the UN, and I agree here with Khulud, that, it's basically saying this is, African problems to be resolved by Africans, by the African Union. There are also worrying signals that a very flimsy roadmap for peace that Port Sudan government has sent to the UN is finding some positive, reception there, and willing to be considered as a framework for peace, while it really depends on, constitutional amendments that the leadership of the army has introduced, that gives the military total control over governance during the war, but also for at least 4 years after the end of the conflict. And therefore, this is an alignment, possible alignment with the plans of autocracy and military control, are not something that the UN should be endorsing. So we are in a situation where there is a dearth of serious initiatives for new ideas about mediation. The next important date is the 15th of April, in about a week from today, when the UK is hosting, with the governments of France and Germany as co-hosts, a meeting in London at the ministerial level, dedicating to the discussion of the crisis in Sudan, to address the issue of humanitarian access and civilian protection in a context of a ceasefire. And that should provide, some framework to initiate a new mediation process. To this meeting, the organizers, the co-hosts, have invited all the regional powers with influence on the belligerents, on the Sudan armed forces, as well as on the rapid support forces. Therefore, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Turkey will all be there, and Qatar as well. And it's important that these regional actors, these regional powers, use their influence with the belligerents to bring them to the table, to agree on, a ceasefire, because the catastrophe that is happening on the ground, at the level of the human cost of this war is just unimaginable, and therefore the Sudanese really need to see this war stopping. But beyond that, it's really important that we insist, whatever mechanism of mediation coming out of this opportunity should take into consideration firmly the expectations and aspirations of civilians. Now, civilians have not, been forceful enough in communicating what they want out of a peace process and what is their roadmap that they propose for such a mediation. And I think they are feeling the urgency of stepping forward and making their voices heard with regard to what they want to see, particularly from this meeting in London, of all these international and regional powers who are basically reflecting on the crisis in Sudan, and how to again initiate a process to end it and to contribute to the protection of civilian and humanitarian access to those most in need because of this crisis.
Thank you, Suleiman. Let me turn to you, Khulud. Both of you spoke about the role of the UN. The UN has a long history in Sudan. The peacekeeping operation in Darfur, the political office in Khartoum that ended with the representative Secretary General persona non grata. There is now, they call it a personal envoy, not special envoy, personal envoy. So it doesn't have to go through the Security Council and be approved in the politics of the Security Council. That's become very complicated in recent years since the Ukraine war began. But there is a role there. There is a history of the UN in Sudan, and as Suleiman said, there is a role that the UN can play. What lessons can you draw from this history of the UN presence in Sudan, past UN experience in Sudan? What the UN could have done differently? What will be your advice, for the UN going forward?
The UN has made, sort of several mistakes. It's has always assumed that the number of people it needs to engage with in Sudan to be quite minimal, and oftentimes that has been limited to those with the guns. Or political elites who, wear nice suits and speak English very well, and therefore are very easy to engage with. And this is despite the fact that the UN has had so far 2 representatives, both the current representative Ramtan Lamamra and his predecessor Volker Perthes, who speak fluent Arabic. But there is this sort of very elitist approach by the UN, and this very sort of statist approach by the UN of seeing Sudan. But Sudan is a nation where the people have always been, to some degree, and to some or greater degree, stronger than the state. And it has, I think, sort of failed to realize that in many ways and throughout many iterations of the different political missions that we've seen in Sudan. It has failed to see also how strong and well-organized civil society is in Sudan, just, the legacy of decades of organization and political engagement. And therefore the UN is always dealing with or sort of effectuating these huge knowledge gaps and these huge network gaps. And in the absence of that engagement, is engaging or dealing mostly with the Sudanese armed forces, the rapid support forces, etc. One huge mistake that I think the UN has made is that it is now engaging with one of the belligerent groups, the Sudanese armed forces, as the government, which means it's giving the Sudanese armed forces the ability to dictate where aid goes and doesn't go, which partially means that the UN is now complicit in supporting the Sudanese armed forces' policy, very well practiced and effective policy of using starvation as a weapon of war. And this means the UN is also unable to play the role it usually plays, which is to be sort of the entity that pushes back against, state repression in order to, effectuate a prioritization of the humanitarian imperative. And not having those cards to play means effectively that the UN is relegated to taking any scraps that the belligerent parties are throwing in its way. And one of those things is the recent ceasefire proposal given by the Sudanese armed forces that is actually half-baked and not really rooted in reality. It assumes that by taking over Khartoum that the RSF has somehow been defeated, but the RSF still controls so much of the country that this setup, of course, cannot work. This proposal that they have just won't be able to work. But the UN, having no ideas of its own, having not invested in engaging with civil society and trying to figure out what the people of Sudan actually want, is now clutching at this, frankly, unviable ceasefire process, which will mean that the UN will be kept busy by the Sudanese armed forces on, engaging on a process that will go nowhere, so that the Sudanese armed forces can instead use the time to continue to prosecute this war. The RSF have also done the same. They've engaged with the UN and told them that they will set up commissions and authorities within the RSF to look at the rape cases, to look at the sexual and gender-based violence, to look at the looting. And the UN to a great degree has bought into that. But these processes are not meant to go anywhere. They're meant to be fodder for the international community, and the international community, frankly, lacking any great ideas or great engagement with the people of Sudan, is left simply to twiddle its thumbs while it engages on those inviable processes. So that's, I think, the biggest lesson that the UN has not learned. And it's unfortunately where we find ourselves today, where the UN should be the biggest champion for Sudan, especially while Sudan is dealing with the world's largest humanitarian crisis, the world's largest hunger crisis, the world's largest displacement crisis, and the world's largest protection crisis, all at the same time. And these are four main areas that the UN usually takes a lead on. And frankly, they have not been able to do so because of sort of the spineless way, frankly, that they have capitulated to the conflict dynamics as they are today.
Suleiman, do you agree with this very stern assessment about the role of the UN in Sudan today?
I see the UN as having taken itself out of the mediation and any pretense of leadership in this. There is a need and a role for forceful intervention from the UN And I'm sorry to say, we are not seeing enough of this happening.
I will make a comment about this whole theme of the UN and
Yeah.
its role in Sudan. But before that, let me ask you one last question. Sudanese people cannot always rely on outsiders to solve their problems. They have to take responsibility. I was talking just recently, for example, just a couple of days ago, to civil society leaders in South Sudan. They were explaining to me the dynamics of this emerging conflict there and so on that is getting out of hand. And they described to me some initiatives like religious leaders from all faiths got together. They sent a letter to the two belligerent, the two camps, offered, to do mediation. This is being supported now by a group of women's groups and civil society organizations and so on. There is a dynamic here, that is not relying on these prominent dignitaries coming from neighboring countries or coming from Addis or IGAD and so on. Sudanese civil society has always been sophisticated. Even the days when we were meeting in 1989 or 1986 at the time, there was always a civil society, the professional associations, lots of personalities who played a role at that time in conflict resolution over the years. Civil society in Sudan today is even more sophisticated now with the popular committees and the role they've been playing and so on. What role can civil society play today in pushing for the peaceful resolution of conflict in Sudan?
There are several initiatives by different civil society groups. I would say, from my perspective, the most representative body at this time is this broad coalition of political actors, professional associations, workers' unions, youth groups, such as and also their structures, a significant part of the existence committees and so on, which is the umbrella organization of SUMOT, that has presented to different potential mediators and to the public opinion in Sudan a roadmap to peace. What the people, they're not claiming that they represent the people of Sudan, but they are the most cohesive and really focused on ending the war and proposing approaches for ending the war that would secure a revival of the democratic transition in the country and civilian rule, and not allowing a dominance to perpetuate itself of the security apparatus over the fate of Sudan. There is this group, but other groups that have set themselves up have also contributed their own visions and have shared this around. There is a constant activity of different sectors of the civil society organizations meeting, discussing these problems and coming out with proposals and roadmaps for solution. The problem is that there is this little disposition among official mediators to listen to civic actors and to give them, a fair hearing and to consider what they propose as solutions for the very intricate and complex problems that are, dividing the country now and leading it down the way further every day towards, more even violent civil war as things stand today. So I believe that it's the responsibility of civic actors to act even more vigorously, more forcefully, to make their voices heard, to present these plans for a roadmap to peace, to potential mediators, and to share this with all those who are, for example, participants in the meeting in London on the April 15th.
Khulud, if you could kindly elaborate a little bit more on what role civil society can play today in pushing for the peaceful mediation of the conflict in Sudan.
Sure. I mean, I think the thing to really point out is that civil society has been working, even the ones who have been displaced, across borders and are now in the neighboring states. They continue to push for changes. There are IDP groups and refugee groups in Darfur and in Chad across the border who are still continuing to organize. There are groups in Kenya and Ethiopia. Of course, Egypt is difficult to organize in because of the security system. But countries like Uganda, countries like in the West in particular, where people are trying to figure out how it is that we can bring about an end to the war, but also articulate what comes next. Now, I think the difficulty here is that mediations tend to be led by international actors, which is why the focus is on what kind of formula would work best for a context like Sudan with the lead of international actors, which is an imperfect setup. But it's the setup that we have had across Sudan's many conflicts. Now, are there answers to be found within the country? Absolutely. That's where the answer will come, and it will only come from within the country. But as I said earlier, this is not just a war where it's Sudanese against Sudanese. There are so many international actors. This is a global war taking place in Sudan, and it will not just be the Sudanese that are able to end it. The international community that feeds the war or that is interested in stopping the war all need to be involved in this. And therefore, the responsibility does not just rest on the people of Sudan to end this war. It rests on others. And I feel that there's often a sort of a propensity to say, the answers will just come when Sudanese people unite and give one common vision. And I think we're trying to create a pluralistic Sudan. We don't all have to have exactly the same vision for what Sudan will look like, but we do have to come together and discuss it. And two, that puts an overdue responsibility on the people of Sudan, who are undergoing the world's largest humanitarian crisis and other crises, to come up with a solution to a war that they did not begin, and to a war that does not benefit them, all while countries in the region, be they African or Gulf countries, continue to profit and to literally make a killing, literally and figuratively make a killing on the backs of Sudanese people who are facing this catastrophe. So the responsibility is everyone's, but the leadership should be with those in Sudan who want to see an end to the war, and those in Sudan who do not want to see Sudan fragment and its resources up for grabs by the nearest sort of middle power in the Gulf. And to me, that requires people much more broader than any political umbrella we have now, be that Samud or any other, to really come together with a sort of a minimum common agenda across the entirety of Sudan, where people who do want to see an end to the war can come together and articulate what that looks like.
Thank you. I learned a lot, from what you said about both the background to this conflict, its dynamics, and so on. But also, we learned a lot from you both about what's going wrong with the mediation or the different mediation that have been attempted in recent time. I agree with you. The role of the UN has been, and it's hard for me to say this because I grew up in the UN. I spent 25 years of my life in the UN, including many years mediating in some of the difficult, situations. So I'm aware of the UN general shortcomings, but I'm also aware of how the UN could be a force for peace. Because of its convening power, its legitimacy, and the action that it takes based on international law and the UN Charter and so on. But I'm afraid the decline of the role of the UN in Sudan is not it's not limited to this country. There is a general trend that started quite a few years ago, which is the general decline of the role of the UN in peace and security generally. The role of the UN in the field of humanitarian action has expanded, and it's appreciated, by everybody. But when it comes to peace and security, the UN has failed, to emerge as the mediator between the East and West on the Ukraine issue. The UN is not the mediator when it comes to the Middle East. It has a Middle East. There is always a colleague there with the title coordinator of the Middle East peace process, although there is no peace process in the Middle East. It's very odd. But all the negotiations that took place recently, they were facilitated by Qatar and Egypt and by the US, that is providing the bombs for Gaza destruction. And in Lebanon, more recently, the deal that was reached, it was reached by a U.S. envoy. also a country that is not completely unbiased to one side or another. So in the peace and security field, generally, the UN is, from what I see, in the lead only in two conflict situations. One is Cyprus, and one is Western Sahara, and it has failed both after many decades of UN being in the lead. So I'm not surprised that people in Sudan are disappointed about the role of the UN. As I said, the UN work has been largely focused in recent years on humanitarian action. Hope this will change, and there have been discussions about this in UN circles. And nevertheless, I really appreciate the fact that in Sudan, like with our guests, there is thinking about how civil society and local actors can push for the conflict resolution process to move forward, and how they can develop a platform, as Khulud said, that can be present in all international initiatives. I hope this will strengthen the role of the local actors, and I hope this will also influence all these international initiatives. With this, I think we come to an end to our podcast. Again, many thanks for your participation. I'm afraid I don't see Sudan in the news anymore. The news are dominated by other conflicts, and the situation in Sudan should be highlighted. It's the largest humanitarian catastrophe in the world today, with 14 million people displaced within Sudan, and people who crossed borders, the millions of people who are food insecure, beyond 200,000 people who died as a result of this war that should come to an end. Thank you very much.